Hi. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for hosting me here. My name's Hillel. I'm Managing Director of Kennett Partners. We're a technology-focused investment fund active in Europe and the US, really focusing on helping growth stage companies grow and develop. What's different about us relative to many of the other VCs that you'll talk to is we focus pretty much exclusively on what we call bootstrapped companies or bootstrapping. People always say, hey, what is bootstrapping? But, by show of hands, are people familiar with the concept of bootstrapping, what this means? Have you heard of it before? Seeing some nods, so great. So for us, bootstrapping is like the opposite of venture capital. It's about building a company without the use of external funding. This is the founders are using their own internally generated resources, specific customer deals to finance and grow their businesses. And so, the best example of a bootstrap company is one where the company has got some level of scale and the founders own the majority of the business. This is the opposite of raising an A round, a B round, a C round, and so on. And so the reason we really love bootstrap companies, are a few. The first is when you don't have an investor to continually fund and finance your business, you need to rely on the customer. And essentially the customer becomes, your bank or your VC. And bootstrap companies tend to be very customer-centric. We sort of take the view that it's easier to convince an investor to raise money, to give you money than a customer. An investor could show some fancy slides and talk about a big market, but a customer is really looking at the product, is there value here, or is this going to be useful to them? The second reason is founders of bootstrap companies, and again, an example is a business that has 1, 2, 3 million in revenues that's raised either nothing or a few $100,000. The CEOs of these companies tend to be very good allocators of capital, right? When you have very limited amount of capital and you allocate it well, for us, we have a lot of respect for that. Very different to having, $10 million financing, being able to go and try a lot of things. These companies are good investment decision makers as to how to develop products, what to do, and how to build value. There's a common misconception that most big tech companies started with venture capital early on. It's actually not. I saw an article yesterday on 50 bootstrap businesses in the tech space that actually got to scale without raising capital. Microsoft is there. When Microsoft started, they started as an outsourced software development business. Dell grew their company to 60 million in revenues without raising capital. The first time they raised any external capital was when they reached 60 million in sales. Broadcom's a great example that didn't raise capital at any point. And so there's a lot of hype and a lot of buzz around venture capital and so on, but actually there's a lot of really interesting and really successful companies that have got to a high level of scale and value without relying on external investors. In terms of the audience, is it how many of you guys are in startups or versus startups? Maybe a show of hands. Okay, great. And in terms of the capital raised externally, to some extent, we actually spoke a little bit earlier. Nice to see you again. So, how do you bootstrap a company? What does this really mean? It sounds great and easy, and a lot of the things that we advise bootstrap companies to do, a traditional VC will tell you not to do. So, we often meet companies that have some element of a service business and a product business and so on, and what a typical VC will say is, hey, forget about the service business, raise capital, and focus on the product business. And typically, what we would say is, well, use the cash flow from that service business to fund your product business such that you get to a point where you have scale in that business. It can take longer, but the real advantage is that you don't give up equity early on. We've seen great examples of companies that we invest in where the customers have financed their research and development. This is 2, 3, 5 million euros that is non-dilutive capital, that comes from the customer as opposed to from the investor. And so, as we develop our business, we're continually working with bootstrap companies to help them develop. The question, is, as a startup, why bootstrap? What's the value in bootstrapping? You can, start a company, get a little bit of traction, raise 5 million, go into TechCrunch, et cetera, like why not do that? And so there's a couple of reasons why I think it's really in your interests to bootstrap, to bootstrap the business. One of them is when you're starting out, people have a plan. I'm going to do this in year 1, year 2, year 3. I'm going to need this capital, Series A, Series B, Series D, and I'm going to end up selling the company. I'm going to own 30% or 40%. But the reality is most business plans, even in the most successful companies, don't actually come to fruition. There's lots of bumps along the way. And so what we say is, rather than raising capital and getting into a consistent routine of being reliant on external capital, you want to delay that decision as long as possible. When businesses are figuring out the model, personally, I actually don't think it's that helpful to have 3 VCs on your board, holding you to account on your business plan in your first year. The reality is it's unpredictable, and founders themselves need to really figure out what is the game plan and develop a level of confidence on the execution of that. I mean, I meet very often founders of companies who have really interesting businesses that are down to single digits ownership of their company, and it's like, hey, why? How did you get here? And it's because money is a drug. Once you raise the A round, it's the B round. I see some nice nodding, and when you start on it, you want to be really mature. You don't want to start early on and have to continuously raise capital. And the sad thing about these companies is when I meet them, they're actually really exciting businesses and they're really good businesses, but the founders feel like they've given way too much equity away. So pushing out that as long as possible, I think is key. By the way, if you have questions, I understand there's no time for questions afterwards, so please feel free to jump in. Happy to answer any questions during the talk. Please.
You're starting a company with this philosophy. Which recommendations do you have for us to finance the first year?
Yeah. So starting a company with this mentality, how do you finance it in the first year? So I think one of the ways that we've seen be really successful is really working with the customers. So when you only have 2 or 3 customers, actually they typically understand that they're working with startups and having deals whereby you can agree terms with them that are favorable to you. So for example, getting paid cash up front in deals is a good way of financing development. Having business models where, in addition to selling a product, there's some consulting or services revenue. I mean, it's really about bringing as much cash forward so that you can use that money for the next 18, 24 months or whatever to really get the product going. So what does tend to happen with bootstrap companies is they tend to get to a stage where they've got scale, 3, 5, 7 million in revenues, and a few things start to happen which change the dynamic. The first is, raising capital becomes relevant because your market is growing. If you're in a market where you're growing 60, 70%, whatever it is, but the market is taking off and is growing at a faster rate than you are, it's an important time to consider raising capital. You don't want to be left, even if you have a nice business, you don't want to be left behind. The other thing is when you start to have a predictable sales model, this is really key. So when we invest in companies, what we want to do is we want to finance sales. We want to finance sales and marketing, and basically, you see the guy over here, we want to give him a rocket, or her, to go. And we don't want to put the rocket on them, and then it's like, okay. And then it's like, what do we do now, right? We want to give them the rocket when they know what to do with it. And so when you have a model in sales that you can deploy capital into, that's a good time to consider raising capital. Finally, secondary liquidity. In year one of your startup, maybe it could be worth $1 billion, maybe it could be worth zero, but when you have 5 million in sales, it's probably worth something. And so taking some liquidity out becomes important because this tends to represent 99% of your personal net wealth. So where VCs say, hey, no, we want you to have everything in the business, we say we actually encourage you to take cash out so that you can sleep at night and work with us on the next the next leg of the journey. How do we work with companies? When you're bootstrapping, you tend to not do a few things. You tend to not hire in certain areas like finance. You tend to hire your friends or people you know locally. You tend to be very cash flow orientated, like we were talking in year one. And when we invest, we help institutionalize the company. So we put a world-class management team around the founder. Chairman, US executive team, VP marketing, VP sales, and so on. We help shift the thinking so that you can now say, all right, the consulting business was great to finance us, but actually it's no longer value. Now we focus on the product business. And then internationalization. Helping companies expand into the US through our partners there is a really key part of what we're doing with bootstrap companies. So that's it. My advice to you is it's not possible in every business, but the extent to which you can avoid the temptation to raise VC early on, and you can find alternative ways of doing that, I'd encourage you to do that. And then when you get to a point where taking capital is a low-risk option, and it's really about financing sales and marketing, that's really the time when you want to, seriously do it. And I think it's important to, to work with partners who are aligned with you. When we invest in founder-led businesses, this is the first time these founders are raising capital. It's all their capital, and so we don't want to bet the farm on their business. We want all of our companies to be successful, and we're very aligned with founder thinking. Typical VC is different. Typical VC will will have 10 companies, 1 or 2 unicorns, many failures, and they diversify through a number of portfolios. You want to work with a partner who is focused on similar objectives to you are and doesn't have the diversification type approach that typical VCs do. Any questions? Okay, so I have 1 minute 49 to go. Maybe I'll do a very quick example of how we've worked with the company and see if I can do this in 1 minute 30. Please.
Normally, how much equity you take once you invest in this company?
How much equity do we take? We take as much or as little equity as you want us to take. We don't want to do less than 10% because we want to have, a reasonable ownership. But, if a founder says, I want you to take 20, 50, whatever it is, we have no ego in that regard. And everyone is different. So a business in the UK we invested in, a company called Receipt Bank. Receipt Bank uses machine learning and AI to automate accounting for companies and bookkeepers. We invested in this business in 2016. We built a world-class leadership team around the founder. We helped the company expand into the US market. we help develop a strategy which is around market leadership in their category. This is a business that prior to our investment, there were no institutional investors in there. You know, the founders owned then and still own a very significant element of the equity. The business has grown from single-digit millions in recurring revenue to multiple tens of millions in recurring revenue, and we help bring in capital after our investment again to finance sales and marketing. And so the founders are very happy because they know when they're bringing capital on board, they can see what it does to the overall pie. This is a company that we think will be very successful, and I think had they raised VC rounds early on, they might be in a similar position, but I think the founders would own a lot less of the equity than they do today. So thank you very much, and I hope you found it interesting.